After defeating the most powerful empire on earth, George Washington stood at the head of an army that adored him in a nation exhausted by war, with weak government, political chaos, unpaid soldiers, and no guarantee democracy would survive. In that moment, he could have reached for something many victorious generals in history had taken without hesitation: a crown. Instead, Washington made a choice so shocking it changed world history. He refused to be king. History is full of men who won wars and then kept power for themselves. Julius Caesar crossed a republic into dictatorship. Napoleon rose from revolution into empire. Again and again, strong leaders promised order and took the throne. So when the American Revolution ended, the world could have guessed what came next: a victorious commander, a weak political system, a tired people hungry for stability, a military loyal to its leader more than any distant legislature. It was the perfect setup for a king, and if any man in America could have taken that role, it was George Washington. He was more than famous. He was revered. To many Americans, he was the indispensable man, the towering figure who had held the Revolution together through defeat, starvation, mutiny, cold, and impossible odds. And yet the most important thing Washington ever did may not have been winning independence. It may have been what he refused to become afterward. This is the story of George Washington, the man who could have ruled Americans and chose instead to teach them how a republic should live. To understand why Washington's refusal mattered, you have to understand how much the country depended on him. By the time the Revolution began, Washington was already a known figure. A Virginia planter, a veteran of the French and Indian War, a man with ambition, discipline, and a powerful physical presence. He was not a fiery theorist like Jefferson, not a brilliant pamphleteer like Thomas Paine, and not the most inventive political mind in the colonies. But he had something just as important. He looked and acted like authority. The Continental Congress needed someone to lead an army made up of different colonies, different temperaments, and different interests. New England had energy and resistance, but Virginia gave the cause broader legitimacy. Washington, tall, composed, and visibly committed, became the symbol that the colonies were fighting together. The truth is that Washington did not win the Revolution through flashy battlefield genius alone. He lost battles. He made mistakes. He endured disasters. But he understood something essential. If the army survived, the Revolution survived. So he held it together. At Trenton, Princeton, Valley Forge, Monmouth, and beyond, he became the center of endurance. Not perfection, endurance. He gave the Revolution shape, discipline, and continuity when it might easily have collapsed into regional quarrels or military defeat. By the end of the war, Washington was not just a commander. He was the one American almost everyone trusted. And that is exactly what made him dangerous. When wars end, soldiers want pay. Nations want order. Politicians want control. And ordinary people want relief. But after the Revolution, the new United States was a mess. Congress was weak. The Articles of Confederation created a loose union that struggled to tax, regulate, or govern effectively. The army had gone unpaid. Officers were frustrated. States argued with one another. Inflation, debt, and uncertainty spread across the fragile republic. This was not a polished democratic success story. It was an unstable experiment. And in unstable experiments, people start looking for one strong hand to steady the ship. That is why Washington's position mattered so much. He had something no civilian government could easily match: loyalty. The army respected him. The public admired him. Foreign observers knew his name. If he had decided that the nation needed firmer rule, temporary, of course, just until stability returned, many would likely have accepted it. This was not fantasy. It was a real historical possibility. In 1782, a military officer named Louis Nicola even wrote Washington suggesting that America consider monarchy, with Washington as king. Nicola argued that Republican government might be too weak and unstable, and that Washington was the obvious figure to anchor the nation. It was one of the great what-if moments in American history. Washington could have ignored it quietly. He could have entertained the idea. He could have let others test public opinion. Instead, he reacted with sharp disapproval. He wanted no part of it. That response matters because it revealed something deep in his character. Washington wanted honor. He wanted reputation. He wanted to be remembered. But he also understood that if the revolution ended in monarchy, then the entire struggle against British power would begin to look hollow. What had Americans suffered for, if not self-government? If they traded one king for another, what exactly had been won? The closest Washington may have come to disaster was not on a battlefield. It was in a camp. In 1783, near Newburgh, New York, anger was boiling inside the Continental Army. Officers were furious over unpaid wages and pensions. Some whispered about defying Congress. Some hinted that the army might pressure civilian leaders by force. This was the kind of crisis that destroys republics. History had seen it before. A military, feeling betrayed, turns toward its beloved general and asks him to act. If Washington had sided with the officers, or even failed to stop them, civilian government in America might have ended before it truly began. Instead, he walked into the crisis and diffused it. At Newburgh, Washington addressed the officers directly. He appealed not only to their interests, but to their patriotism, their sacrifice, and their memory of what they had fought for. And then, in one of the most famous moments of his life, he reached into his pocket, pulled out spectacles, and said that he had grown gray and almost blind in the service of his country. The gesture was simple, human, powerful. It broke the mood in the room. Men who might have followed anger back into political violence were reminded that their commander had suffered alongside them. Washington did not seize the anger of the army and convert it into power. He redirected it away from himself. That is the point. He could control the army. Instead, he taught it restraint. In that moment, Washington may have saved the American Republic before it even properly existed. And then came the act that astonished the world. In December 1783, George Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief and returned his military authority to Congress. That may sound normal to modern ears. Presidents leave office. Generals retire. Power changes hands. But in the 18th century, this was extraordinary. A victorious commander surrendering power voluntarily, walking away from military glory at the height of national admiration, returning to private life instead of dominating public life. To many observers, this was almost unbelievable. King George III is said to have remarked that if Washington truly gave up power and returned to his farm, he would be the greatest man in the world. Why was it so astonishing? Because Washington was acting against one of history's strongest patterns. Most men do not walk away when everyone is ready to follow them. Most men tell themselves they are necessary. Most men begin by holding power for the public good and end by holding it because they can no longer imagine anyone else in charge. Washington did something rarer. He showed that authority in a republic is not proven by how tightly you hold it. It is proven by your willingness to surrender it. He went home to Mount Vernon, not because the nation no longer needed him, but because the nation needed the example of a leader who would not become master. Of course, Washington's story did not end at Mount Vernon. The weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation became impossible to ignore. The country needed a stronger framework. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to write what became the United States Constitution, and Washington presided over the convention. Even there, his presence mattered enormously. He gave legitimacy to the process. People trusted that if Washington supported the new Constitution, it probably was not a scheme for tyranny. Then, in 1789, he became the first President of the United States. And here Once again, the monarchy question quietly returned. How should a president behave? What should he be called? How grand should the office seem? Would the presidency slowly drift into kingship under another name? Washington understood the danger. The new executive had to be strong enough to govern but limited enough to remain Republican. So he moved carefully. He embraced dignity but avoided royal extravagance. He accepted ceremony but not a crown. He used the office but tried not to become larger than the Constitution itself. He was inventing the presidency while trying to prevent it from becoming a throne. That balancing act mattered. Too weak, and the office would fail. Too grand, and the revolution's fears would return. Washington's personal discipline helped set the tone. He gave the office authority without turning it into monarchy. In a new nation, precedent becomes destiny. And Washington knew it. If Washington had only refused monarchy once, that would already be enough to secure his place in history. But he refused excess power again. After serving 2 terms as president, he stepped down. He did not have to. He remained enormously respected. He almost certainly could have served longer. There was no constitutional term limit yet. If he had wanted a 3rd term, many Americans would have supported him. But Washington understood that republics can die not only from coups, but from habits. If one man remains in power too long, even legally, people begin to associate the nation with the individual. Leadership starts to look permanent. Institutions begin to weaken under the shadow of personality. So once again, Washington stepped away. His farewell address warned against factionalism, excessive party spirit, regional division, and foreign entanglements. But its deepest message may have been implicit. No citizen, not even the most admired one, should become bigger than the republic. That second withdrawal sealed the first. Washington did not merely refuse to be king in theory. He refused over and over to let love, necessity, admiration, or crisis turn him into one. It is easy to turn Washington into a marble statue and miss the living drama of what he did. He was not perfect. He was not beyond criticism. He lived inside the contradictions of his age, including the deepest moral contradiction in early American life: slavery. He could be ambitious, proud, reserved, and intensely conscious of reputation. But that is part of what makes his restraint so remarkable. Washington was not a man without ego. He was a man with enormous stature who chose limits, and that decision helped establish one of the Central American ideals. In a republic, power is held in trust, not owned. That idea is fragile. It depends on laws, institutions, and constitutions, but also on character. It depends on leaders willing to stop, to yield, to accept that the office is not the self. Washington gave the United States more than military victory. He gave it political restraint at the moment restraint was least likely. He showed that the revolution was not just about overthrowing a king overseas. It was about resisting the temptation to create one at home. That is why his refusal still echoes. Not because it was inevitable, but because it wasn't. In another timeline, George Washington becomes America's first monarch. Maybe not in name at first. Maybe just protector, chief magistrate for life, emergency ruler, father of the nation with expanded powers. History is full of titles that slowly harden into crowns. But that is not what happened. At the most dangerous moments, when the army was angry, when government was weak, when admiration was overwhelming, when precedent was unwritten, Washington chose something harder than conquest. He chose self-limitation. He laid down his sword. He surrendered command. He served as president, then left. And by leaving, he taught the country what power in a republic was supposed to look like. That is why George Washington matters. Not only because he helped win America, but because, when America might have crowned him, he refused. And in refusing to be king, he helped make a republic possible.